Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast in 10 minutes or less, or at least we tried. Definitely no more than 15 minutes. Today we're going to talk about a building that has been connected to major historical events for almost 15 centuries. The Church of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Constantinople, in modern-day Turkey, is in the news right now. Any building in continual use for 1500 years is going to have a history and will make it in the news every few centuries or so. Hagia Sophia is definitely no exception. It was a church, a mosque, a museum, and now, not without some controversy, is a mosque again. The Church of Hagia Sophia, or Holy Wisdom or Saint Wisdom, is not named after a person, but is instead named after a concept. The current Hagia Sophia is actually the new Hagia Sophia. The original was built in the time of Constantius, Constantine's son, in the mid-300s, and it was known as the Big Church. And it later started to be called Hagia Sophia. This was the cathedral church of the Bishop of Constantinople, who would later become the Patriarch of Constantinople. It was built in the classic basilica-style church, and there's more info on that in the audio of Sidetrack Episode 9. Now, this original Hagia Sophia burned and was renovated a few times in the early 400s, and it was finally destroyed with much else of Constantinople during the Nika riots of 532. But believe it or not, some of the pieces of that original Hagia Sophia are still extant and on display in Istanbul. Now, what do you do when a big part of your city is burned and destroyed in a massive riot? That's no big deal for Justinian. For him, it's a blank slate. Let's talk a little bit about the dimensions of the Hagia Sophia, the current one. It's 82 by 73 meters, or about 270 by 240 feet. And it's 55 meters, or 180 feet tall. And the dome has a diameter of 55 meters. It's a massive building, especially for the time period of the early 500s. Not until the much later Middle Ages were bigger churches built in Europe. Let's talk a little bit about the construction used. Hagia Sophia is a huge building by any standards. Like I said, bigger churches were built in the Middle Ages hundreds and even close to 1,000 years later with that much more technological advances in building technology. And those churches usually in the Middle Ages took generations. Some of them aren't even technically done, and they were started in the Middle Ages. Hagia Sophia, on the other hand, was built in, count 'em, 5 years. That's it, 5 years. The original was destroyed in 532. The new one was dedicated and consecrated in 537. How was it built? The construction was really amazing. Obviously, it was built really quickly. Justinian really threw the entire weight of the Byzantine Empire into this project. The entire economy and the finances of the empire were deployed, and construction materials were brought from all over the empire. It's really the Manhattan Project and the moon landing and any other gigantic government project you can think of, all balled into one. The very best building materials were brought in from all over Europe and Asia, different types of marble, gold, silver, tesserae, made from exotic materials, you name it. Justinian was really a very tough customer for an architect. His goal, build a church like nothing that was ever seen before. Build a building like nothing had ever been seen before. He brought in 2 architects, Antimios of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, and they were in charge of this whole project. They were architect, engineer, contractor, everything. Neither of them were really architects as such. They were scientists and mathematicians of late antiquity. They're definitely incredibly smart and well-educated as anyone, but they were facing a huge engineering task. They also needed to meet Justinian's expectations, plus build in a place that is prone to earthquakes, along with all the normal problems that come with building an enormous edifice of logistics and moving materials and figuring out problems. Justinian wanted the classic basilica combined with something like the domed Pantheon of Rome. Building a huge basilica wasn't a big deal. A number of really large basilicas had been built already all over the place. Building something like the Pantheon wasn't easy, but it had been done before. And, you know, the blueprint was out there for how to do that sort of construction. But the incredible idea was to put these two styles together. That had never been conceived of before. And Themios and Isidore needed to square the circle, so to speak. They started with 4 enormous arches perpendicular to each other. That was a good first step, but that alone couldn't support the dome. So that's where the architects came up with the idea to square the circle. What they did is they connected the triangular space formed between the arches with something called a pendentive. This pendentive feature gave the dome a solid place to rest on the arches. So that huge, massive dome that's a circle could now sit on top of the square formed by those arches. Now, arches are incredibly strong. Their job is to transfer the weight of the dome, this massive dome, to the ground. The Roman arch, though, the classic Roman arch, had a serious flaw. They tended to kick out from the bottom when they started to get loaded down. The medieval Western church builders addressed this with the flying buttress. You really just needed, and really the only thing available to Anthemius and his partner was to just build massive blocks to prevent those arches from kicking out. This is the core of the building, and I think this is what makes Hagia Sophia to me so incredibly beautiful. It looks so massive from the outside. It just sits there and dominates the entire landscape. It looks like it's just saying, like, try to move me. I'm here forever. The minarets that you can see on pictures, they were added much, much later when Hagia Sophia was turned into a mosque. And the way whoever designed those minarets, I think they made in this edifice look even more powerful. I think some of the times when minarets were added to other churches, they didn't quite go as well as they go with Hagia Sophia. It kind of like balances out the whole massiveness of the structure. But again, that's just I'm an armchair historian, now I'm an armchair architectural critic, so take that for what it's worth. The core of the structure, that massiveness, is what allows the interior to be the exact opposite. The inside is light and airy. It just looks like it could float away into the heavens. The architects used so many techniques in this building to compensate for earthquake damage, which is another interesting facet of the building. Initially, it didn't work so well for the dome. The first dome collapsed about 20 years after the completion in 537. Isidore, the other architect, his nephew, fixed the dome and made it even larger. He added a number of small arches around the base of the dome, which lightened the dome and actually, as a side benefit, brought in more light into the church. That dome was damaged and rebuilt again in an earthquake in the 900s. Let's talk a little bit about more about the interior. Every square inch of this place was covered in religious art. Mosaics of saints, Christ, Mary, bishops, and emperors. Innovations in the use of glass to make the mosaics really make them pop everywhere. The mosaic of Christ Pantocrator is one of the most particularly beautiful examples of the style. The whole place is just dripping with iconography and the most wealthy decoration possible. And I think this is a place where you might see like people who are more towards a simple, plain church would be really turned off by Hagia Sophia. It's like, why do they have to decorate every square inch of it? But you really see what they were really going for a motif there. The people were impressed too. The conversion story of the Rus to Christianity is that they went to Hagia Sophia and said they didn't know whether they were on heaven or earth. So you take that for what people who are used to wooden buildings and stone buildings, and then they walk into this amazing place. So in the end, Justin, after this construction, he had something to brag about. Boy, did he. There's a quote as of him saying something like he outdid Solomon, referring to the Temple of Jerusalem. And so those are really big words. You're saying you outdid Solomon. Hagia Sophia was splendid and the center of the Eastern Roman Byzantine universe. It still saw some pretty rough time throughout the ages. The mid-700s and the early 800s saw iconoclasm, and many of the original religious art and iconography was removed and destroyed at that point. After iconoclasm was decreed a heresy, as much of that art was replaced and restored as possible. Then we go a little forward to 1204. The Venetians conquered Constantinople and they looted everything they could get their hands on. They really desecrated Hagia Sophia. They even took roof tiles from it. This was really bad for the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople. It was really great for Venice, though. They took all that loot back to Venice and decorated their city like crazy. So that was there was a rough 200 years for the Byzantines and just a general decline of the city of Constantinople. Then in 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople. At that point, they turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque. And they really had to renovate it to fit the requirements of a mosque. They covered or removed the Christian religious iconography and architectural elements. Then they went and added Islamic sacred architectural elements. Orthodox Christianity is big on religious artistic representation. Islam, not so much. Hagia Sophia inspired both later church construction and mosque construction. Hagia Sophia was a mosque for a really long time, but during the Turkish revolution of sorts under Ataturk, it was converted into a secular museum during the 1930s. Many of the mosaics that were covered were restored. The heritage of both the Islamic and Christian periods were celebrated until July of 2020, when Turkish President Erdogan had Hagia Sophia turned back into a mosque. The international community was not very excited about this really blatant political move. I am absolutely sure this will not be the last chapter in the story of a building that has seen a great deal of change and conflict in its 1500 years of existence. So this was just another bit of papal and church history in 10 minutes. Thank you to all our patrons on Patreon who do a large part to help this whole thing happen. Join us there to support the show. Make sure you click like, subscribe, and then ring the bell to get more videos like this. And I will see you next time.